December 17th, 1944. Stalag 9B, near Bad Orb, Germany. The morning air cuts like a blade. Frost clings to the barbed wire fencing, glinting in the pale winter sun. German guards pace the perimeter, their breath visible in the freezing air, rifles slung across their shoulders. Behind the wire, a formation of American soldiers stands at attention. Black men in tattered uniforms, faces weathered by combat, eyes forward. The guards expected something different. They had been told stories, propaganda, warnings about inferior soldiers, undisciplined, incapable. But what they see doesn't match the narrative. These men stand straight despite exhaustion. They respond to commands with precision. They carry themselves not as broken prisoners, but as soldiers who know their worth. One guard, barely 20 years old, watches closely. He was raised on images of racial hierarchy, taught who was civilized and who was not. Yet here, in this frozen camp in the heart of Germany, the men behind the wire are forcing him to question everything. The disconnect is immediate, unsettling, and it will only deepen. To understand what those German guards witnessed, you must first understand where these men came from. In 1940s America, freedom was not universal. It was conditional. It depended on the color of your skin. Across the Ruhr, American South, and in many parts of the North, Jim Crow laws dictated every aspect of life for Black Americans. Separate schools, separate water fountains, separate entrances to buildings, separate sections on buses and trains. Black citizens could not vote in many states. They faced violence for asserting their rights. Lynchings remained common. The justice system offered no protection. This was not ancient history. This was the America that existed when war broke out in Europe. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States was thrust into a global conflict. The call went out for soldiers, for volunteers, for patriots willing to defend their nation. Black Americans heard that call. They answered it in staggering numbers. Over 1 million black men and women would serve in the U.S. military during World War II. They did not do this because America had been kind to them. They did it despite how America had treated them. They believed, hoped, that proving their courage, their competence, their loyalty might earn them the equality they had been denied. The idea was simple but painful. Earn freedom abroad, and perhaps claim it at home. But the military they joined was segregated. Policies were clear. Black soldiers served in separate units, commanded mostly by white officers. The Army maintained that integration would harm morale and efficiency. These were not fringe opinions. They were official doctrine. Black soldiers were initially relegated to support roles: quartermaster companies, construction battalions, transport units. The assumption was that black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage for combat. This belief ran deep. It shaped training. It shaped deployment. It shaped every interaction between black soldiers and the institution they served. Yet demand for combat troops grew as the war intensified. Slowly, reluctantly, the military began forming black combat units. The 92nd Infantry Division, known as the Buffalo Soldiers, was activated. The 761st Tank Battalion received training in armored warfare. The 99th Fighter Squadron, later part of the Tuskegee Airmen, took to the skies. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion prepared for frontline duty. These units trained harder than most. They knew they carried the weight of proving an entire race's worth. Failure was not an option. It would confirm every prejudice, every stereotype, every excuse to keep black Americans in their assigned place. The men who would eventually end up in German POW camps came from these units. They came from cities like Detroit, Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. They came from small towns in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Texas. Many had never left their home states before enlisting. Some were college-educated. Others had barely attended school. What united them was a dual consciousness, fighting for a country that did not fully recognize their humanity, while knowing the enemy they faced was even worse. Nazi Germany had made racial supremacy its core ideology. Black soldiers understood the stakes. They were not fighting for the America that existed. They were fighting for the America that might be, and they were willing to die for that possibility. By late 1944, these units were deployed across Europe. The 92nd Infantry Division fought through the brutal Italian campaign, facing German mountain positions and entrenched defenses in terrain that favored the defender. The 761st Tank Battalion arrived in France in October 1944, attached to General Patton's Third Army. Patton, despite his personal prejudices, told them bluntly, "I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." And they did. For 183 consecutive days, the 761st remained in combat, longer than any other armored unit in the war. They fought at the Siegfried Line. They liberated French towns. They pushed deep into Germany itself. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion supported infantry operations during the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's desperate winter offensive launched in December 1944. When German forces smashed through American lines in the Ardennes forest, the 333rd found itself surrounded near the Belgian town of Wereth. The battle was chaos, snow, confusion, overwhelming enemy numbers. Some soldiers were killed in action. Others were captured. 11 men from the 333rd's Battery C were taken prisoner on December 17, 1944, the same date our opening scene began. They would not reach a POW camp. Instead, they were handed over to SS troops and murdered in a nearby field, their bodies discovered weeks later bearing evidence of torture. This atrocity, the Wereth Massacre, remained largely unknown for decades, another buried chapter of black soldiers' sacrifice. But most captured black soldiers did reach POW camps. They were transported to stalags, prisoner of war camps, scattered across Germany and occupied territories. Stalag 9B near Bad Orb, Stalag 2B in Pomerania, Stalag 7A near Munich, Stalag 9C near Molsdorf. The Geneva Convention theoretically protected them. In practice, conditions varied wildly depending on location, guards, and timing. Food was scarce. Medical care, minimal. Winter cold was brutal. But they were alive, and they were still soldiers. The German guards who received them operated under a complex ideological framework. Nazi propaganda had spent years constructing racial hierarchies. Jews occupied the lowest rung. Slavs were considered subhuman. Black people were depicted as primitive, animalistic, lacking civilization. German children were shown images and films reinforcing these ideas. Soldiers absorbed this messaging through training and constant exposure. When Black American POWs arrived, guards expected savagery, ignorance, disorder. They anticipated men who confirmed their worldview. Instead, they encountered soldiers who maintained military discipline even in captivity. Men who organized themselves, who shared rations fairly, who kept their barracks orderly despite deprivation, who spoke English and sometimes German, who read books when available, who composed letters home with careful thought, who sang spirituals and jazz with haunting beauty. The cognitive dissonance was immediate. Some guards dismissed it as exception. Others began to question. A few were genuinely shaken. These men did not fit the propaganda. They did not fit the comfortable categories that made oppression acceptable. And in the strange suspended reality of a POW camp, where survival depended on routines and small interactions, German guards and black prisoners existed in proximity long enough for humanity to become undeniable. Behind every uniform was a man with a name, a family, a life interrupted. Private James Stewart from Alabama wrote letters to his mother describing the cold in Europe, carefully avoiding details that would worry her. He mentioned the food, never enough, and the camaraderie, always emphasizing the positive. He did not tell her about the firefights, the fear, the friend who died beside him. Corporal Leon Bass, who would survive capture and later become an educator, carried photographs of his sweetheart in his pocket through combat and captivity. These small anchors to home sustained men who lived with a dual burden no white soldier fully understood. They fought two enemies, the Nazi regime and the racism embedded in their own ranks. They endured insults from fellow American soldiers. They faced discrimination at bases even in combat zones. Instances of black soldiers being denied entry, too. Service clubs, while German POWs were welcomed, remained documented and verified. Yet they continued. They volunteered for dangerous missions. They held positions under fire. They earned medals that were often downgraded or denied because of their race. The psychological weight was immense, proving worthiness while knowing that worthiness should never have been questioned. Fighting for principles their own country violated daily. And when captured, carrying that complexity into enemy territory. The combat record speaks clearly. The 761st Tank Battalion earned a Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. During the Battle of the Bulge, they spearheaded assaults against fortified German positions, losing tanks but never breaking. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, already wounded, refused evacuation and continued fighting until killed in action, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor in 1997, 53 years late. The 92nd Infantry Division captured over 23,000 enemy soldiers in Italy. They breached the Gothic Line, a defensive system the Germans considered impenetrable. Casualties were high. Courage was constant. The 99th Fighter Squadron, part of the famed Tuskegee Airmen, flew bomber escort missions with a record so exceptional that bomber crews specifically requested them. Their performance destroyed the myth of black incompetence in technical roles. Statistics reveal sacrifice. Approximately 708 black Americans were killed in combat during World War II. Thousands more were wounded. Several hundred became prisoners of war. These numbers, though smaller than white casualties due to fewer black soldiers in frontline roles, represented men who exceeded every expectation placed upon them. They earned Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, Distinguished Service Crosses. They returned fire when ambushed. They held ground when ordered. They charged when commanded. And when captured, they carried that discipline into captivity. Nazi Germany recognized an opportunity. If black American soldiers could be turned against their own country, it might fracture Allied unity. Propaganda leaflets were dropped over black units. Radio broadcasts targeted them specifically. The messages were calculated. Why fight for a country that lynches you? Why die for people who deny you basic rights? Germany understands your struggle. Surrender and be treated fairly. Some leaflets depicted the Statue of Liberty holding a noose instead of a torch. Others promised better treatment as POWs than they received as citizens at home. The irony was not lost on black soldiers. They knew the reality of Nazi racial ideology. They had seen what happened to Jews, to Slavs, to anyone deemed inferior. They understood that Hitler's regime was not their ally, regardless of America's hypocrisy. The propaganda largely failed. Desertion rates among black units were no higher than white units, often lower. When captured, black soldiers did not become collaborators. They remained loyal despite every reason not to be. This confused German intelligence officers who had believed their psychological warfare would work. They had assumed oppression would breed disloyalty. Instead, it had forged resilience. These men distinguished between hating injustice and abandoning principle. They wanted America to change, not to fall. Life in the stalags was survival measured in small victories. Morning roll call in freezing temperatures, watery soup served once daily, bread rations that never satisfied hunger, wooden bunks without mattresses, disease spreading through crowded barracks, mail from home arriving months late, if at all. Yet black POWs established order within chaos. They formed committees to distribute food fairly. They organized educational sessions where literate soldiers taught others to read. They held religious services, blending Christian hymns with African American spirituals that resonated through camp walls. German guards heard these songs and could not reconcile the beauty with their taught beliefs about primitive peoples. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Injuries from combat went untreated. Infections festered. Weight loss was universal. Some men dropped 40, 50 pounds. Survival required mental strength as much as physical. POWs created elaborate fantasies about meals they would eat upon release. They memorized poems. They played chess with pieces carved from scraps. They maintained military ranks and protocol, saluting officers, following chain of command. This structure provided psychological stability. It reminded them they were soldiers, not animals, and it impressed even hostile guards. Not all guards experienced transformation. Some remained committed Nazis until the end. But others, particularly younger conscripts and older reservists, found their certainties eroding. A guard named Klaus, interviewed decades later, admitted his shock. They were not what we were told. They had discipline. They helped each other. They were educated. Another, Hans, recalled a black sergeant who spoke fluent German and discussed philosophy, literature, military strategy. How could this be the inferior race? He knew things I did not know. These moments accumulated. Guards witnessed white and black American POWs supporting each other despite the segregation that had defined their service. They saw men weak from hunger still sharing rations with those weaker. They watched prisoners maintain dignity when cruelty would have been understandable. The propaganda narrative cracked under the weight of observed reality, and in that crack, doubt entered. Winter 1945. Stalag 9B. The camp population swells as more American POWs arrive, captured during the final German offensives. Food supplies collapse. Rations shrink to starvation levels. A Red Cross shipment arrives. One crate of parcels for hundreds of men. Tension erupts. Prisoners argue. Desperation breeds conflict. The German commandant watches, expecting violence. Chaos, confirmation of his beliefs about inferior peoples losing control under pressure. Instead, he witnesses something else entirely. A black sergeant named William McBurney steps forward. He is gaunt, weakened by months of captivity, but his voice carries authority. He proposes a system. Inventory everything. Divide it equally. By barracks, rotate distribution so everyone receives something eventually. White POWs, some from southern states who had never taken orders from a black man, hesitate. Then slowly, they nod. They accept his plan. McBurney organizes the distribution with meticulous fairness. No favoritism, no hierarchy. Every man receives his share. The commandant, standing at a distance, watches in silence. His adjutant mutters, "They should be at each other's throats." But they are not. They are cooperating under the leadership of a man Nazi ideology insists cannot lead. At Stalag 7 near Munich, a different crisis unfolds. Typhus spreads through the barracks. The camp has no medicine, inadequate sanitation, and guards who refuse to enter infected areas. White prisoners begin isolating themselves, trying to avoid contagion. Black POWs do not have that luxury. Their barracks is already infected. Corporal Joseph Stevenson, a medic captured at the Bulge, tends to the sick despite lacking supplies. He boils water to sterilize rags. He moves the most critical cases near the stove for warmth. He organizes healthy prisoners to dispose of waste properly, creating sanitation protocols from nothing. Then, he crosses to the white barracks and offers help. Some refuse. Others, seeing their own medics overwhelmed, accept. Stevenson treats everyone equally. German guards observe a black man saving white lives while risking his own. One guard, a former schoolteacher named Ernst, later wrote, "I was taught he was subhuman, but he had more humanity than anyone in that camp." March 1945. Stalag II on B in Pomerania. Soviet forces advance from the east. The camp prepares for evacuation. German guards grow anxious, trigger-happy, expecting prisoners to riot or escape. Instead, American POWs, black and white together, organize themselves into marching columns. They assign stronger men to help the weak. They pool remaining rations for those most likely to collapse. Senior officers, including a black captain, named James McCoy, coordinate with German officers to ensure the march proceeds orderly. McCoy speaks German, having studied it before the war. He negotiates rest stops, access to water, permission to bury men who die along the route. His competence frustrates the camp adjutant, who cannot reconcile this man's abilities with his taught beliefs. The death march covers over 200 miles. Many perish from exhaustion, cold, or execution. But those who survive do so partly because of structures established by black leadership working alongside white officers, both groups finally recognizing their shared fate. These were not isolated incidents. Across dozens of camps, similar scenes repeated. Black POWs demonstrating resourcefulness, organization, courage, compassion. Not because they sought to prove anything to their captors, but because that was who they were. April 1945. Liberation approaches. Allied forces push deeper into Germany from both east and west. Camp guards receive conflicting orders, hold prisoners, evacuate them, execute them, abandon posts, and flee. In this chaos, the final test arrives. At Stalag 9 near Molsdorf, rumors spread that SS units are coming to liquidate prisoners before Allied arrival. White and black POWs alike understand what this means. They have heard whispers about camps where different rules applied, where prisoners disappeared, where smoke rose from chimneys day and night. Terror grips the compound. Sergeant Leon Bass returned to Philadelphia and immediately encountered segregation at the train station. Separate waiting rooms, separate water fountains. He stood in uniform, having survived combat and captivity, staring at a sign that read, "Colored Only." The dissonance was crushing. He had just helped defeat a regime built on racial supremacy. Now he stood in a country practicing a softer version of the same ideology. Bass later recalled, "We fought 2 wars, one against the enemy, one for recognition as men." That second war did not end in 1945. It was only beginning. Corporal Joseph Stevenson, the medic who saved lives in the typhus-infected camp, returned to Georgia. He entered a restaurant in his hometown wearing his uniform and medals. The owner refused to serve him. When Stevenson protested, citing his service, the owner replied, "I don't care where you've been or what you did. You're still a Negro." Stevenson left quietly, not out of acceptance but survival. Men had been lynched for less. The uniform that earned respect from German guards and white fellow prisoners meant nothing to civilians who saw only skin color. This was the bitter reality for thousands of black veterans. The GI Bill, designed to help returning soldiers transition to civilian life, theoretically applied to all veterans. In practice, its benefits were often denied to black Americans. Applications for home loans were rejected. Access to quality education was blocked. Job training programs excluded them. Southern states administered the program with explicit discrimination. Northern states practiced subtler forms of denial. The promise of reward for service evaporated into the same systemic racism that existed before the war. Black veterans who had led men in combat found themselves relegated to menial jobs. Those who had earned commendations could not buy homes in certain neighborhoods. The nation they saved did not save them in return. Some refused to accept this quietly. Black veterans became leaders in the emerging civil rights movement. They had seen the world, confronted death, and survived. They would not tolerate oppression silently. In Mississippi, Medgar Evers returned from service in Europe and began organizing voter registration drives, fully aware of the danger. In South Carolina, Isaac Woodard, still in uniform and recently discharged, was beaten and blinded by police for asking to use a restroom. His case galvanized national attention. These incidents multiplied. Black veterans, trained in warfare, disciplined by military service, and emboldened by having defeated history's most notorious racist regime, became catalysts for change. The courage they displayed in combat now fueled demands for justice at home. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Germany grappled with its own reckoning. The Nuremberg trials exposed the full horror of Nazi crimes. Documentation emerged. Testimony accumulated. The world learned what systematic racial hatred produced. Some former guards who had supervised American POWs watched these revelations with quiet discomfort. A few gave testimony during war crimes investigations. Their statements, preserved in military archives, reveal surprising admissions. A guard identified only as Werner K. stated in a 1946 deposition, "The American Negro prisoners conducted themselves with more discipline than we expected. They were not as we were taught." Another, Friedrich M., wrote in his personal diary, discovered decades later, "I guarded men I was told were inferior. They were not. This troubles me." These were not widespread confessions. Most former guards never spoke publicly about their experiences. Silence was easier than confronting complicity. But the testimonies that do exist confirm what black POWs always knew. Their conduct, their humanity, their dignity had made an impression impossible to ignore. Some guards carried that cognitive dissonance to their graves. Others quietly abandoned the racist beliefs they had held. A small number, very few, became advocates for reconciliation and truth-telling in post-war Germany. The impact was limited but real. Seeds of doubt planted in POW camps contributed, however marginally, to Germany's eventual confrontation with its past. In America, political pressure for change mounted. President Harry Truman, influenced by the advocacy of black veterans, labor leaders, and civil rights activists, faced a moral and political decision. On July 26, 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces. The order stated, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." Implementation was slow, resisted by senior officers, and incomplete for years. But the policy established a precedent. The military, which had sent black soldiers into combat in segregated units, would now integrate. The irony was not lost on veterans who had already proven integration worked. In POW camps, on death marches, in moments of crisis where survival demanded cooperation regardless of race. The Korean War accelerated integration out of necessity. By 1953, the military was substantially integrated. This did not eliminate racism, but it created structural opportunities that had not existed before. Black officers commanded white troops. Mixed-race units fought together. The military became, imperfectly, one of the more integrated institutions in American society. This transformation traced directly back to World War II. Two veterans who refused to accept the old order and whose combat record made segregation indefensible. Recognition came slowly, painfully, inadequately. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, was awarded to 433 individuals for actions in World War II. None went to black soldiers at the time. In 1993, the Army commissioned a study to investigate racial disparity in medal awards. Researchers found systematic discrimination. Recommendations for black soldiers' medals had been routinely downgraded or denied. In 1997, 52 years after the war ended, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II Sudden Siege veterans. Only one, Vernon Baker, was still alive to receive it. The others were honored posthumously. Justice delayed by half a century. Families received medals their fathers and grandfathers should have worn home in 1945. The ceremony was meaningful. It was also an admission of historical injustice that could never be fully repaired. The story of black POWs in World War II is not a story of redemption. It is a story of resistance against enemies foreign and domestic, against ideologies that denied their humanity, against a world that demanded they prove what should never have required proof. These men did not need to earn their dignity. They possessed it inherently. What they did, through discipline and courage and quiet endurance, was force others to see what had always been there. In the frozen camps of Germany, human beings encountered each other beyond the reach of comfortable propaganda. German guards raised on hate confronted evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. Some rejected that evidence, others could not. The transformation was incomplete, imperfect, limited. But it happened, and it happened because black soldiers, even in captivity, refused to become what their captors expected. They remained themselves, flawed, exhausted, human beings capable of extraordinary strength. The war these men fought had 3 fronts. The first against Nazi Germany, the second against the racism embedded in their own military and nation, the third within themselves, maintaining hope when hope seemed foolish, believing in principles that were not extended to them, loving a country that did not fully love them back. They won the first war. They advanced the second, though it continues still. And the third, the interior battle, they fought every single day until they could fight no more. Their legacy is not simple victory. It is complexity. It is the uncomfortable truth that courage and injustice coexisted, that men could be heroes abroad and victims at home, that liberation did not guarantee freedom. The German guards who questioned their beliefs because of these men carried that doubt forward, contributing in small ways to a society that would eventually confront its crimes. The American systems that denied these soldiers equality were eventually forced to change, pushed by veterans who would no longer accept subjugation after defeating tyranny. What remains is memory. Names carved in stone, medals awarded too late, testimonies preserved in archives, and the knowledge that humanity, when witnessed closely enough, becomes undeniable. The men behind the wire at Stalag 9B and camps across Germany left their captors questioning everything. They left history a record of dignity under duress. They left us the responsibility to remember not just their sacrifice, but the world that made such sacrifice necessary. That is the burden of their story, and it is also its power.